Hello there. Brussels has announced huge expansion plans to include Ukraine by 2030. But is this a bridge too far for the European Union? Speaking at the Bled Strategic Forum in Slovenia, the EU Council President, Charles Michel, announced a big bang expansion of the European Union to the gathering of Balkan leaders. Enlargement is no longer a dream, he told them. It is time to move forward. I believe we must be ready, on both sides, by 2030 to enlarge. Countries like North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia and Bosnia and Herzegovina could all be taken in after 2030 if they meet the criteria. And don't for a moment think that this is just Charles Michel. This will be part of a wider plan. But what of Ukraine? Will the Russian invasion be over by 2030? Or is this the opening gambit in getting Zelensky to parley with Putin over ceding the Crimea and much of the east of Ukraine to Russia in exchange for a fast-tracked EU membership? But to do this, the EU will need to embark on a series of major EU treaty changes to scrap some, if not all, of the remaining member state vetoes, as well as change the financial system to allow a huge new expansion budget to get the ball rolling. And that might mean moving towards Guy Verhofstadt's dream of full monetary union, to give the European Central Bank the full powers of a true national central bank. It would even mean changing the EU voting system. Not only that, the key area of foreign policy would also end up under the sole sovereign power of Brussels, something that would inevitably lead to all EU member state armed forces coming under the control of the EU Commission. Without all of that, there would be too much inter-member state squabbling about who picks up the tab, who loses and who wins, because this will be a huge ask for the EU taxpayer. Especially where Ukraine is concerned. It would be the poorest and most damaged new member state if it were ever to happen. But it will also be hated by those within the EU who would quite like their own country to remain just that. But will the new treaty amendments, or even a whole brand new treaty, remove the right to leave by taking out Article 50? The Times reports that this will be the biggest shake-up since the Lisbon Treaty, a gruelling marathon, it says. The EU is about to change beyond recognition, and I see this as an opportunistic power grab by the Eurocrats. Never let the opportunity offered by a crisis like the Russian invasion of Ukraine to be missed. These new treaties will further subjugate member states. The power will become more concentrated with the Commission. But the Europhiles will see this as a necessary step to make the EU stronger, more powerful, which is exactly what Charles Michel said in his speech. While those same Europhiles in the UK, the likes of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, for example, are demanding ever more devolution. In their case, more likely leading to disintegration. What the EU is embarking on is a massive exercise in reverse devolution. It's called centralisation. Sounds like the climb for the UK rejoiner brigade just got a lot steeper. And with this expansion comes more heads of state around the EU Council table, more MEPs and a much larger EU Commission. But each country would be giving up, not sharing as they like to put it, but giving up a lot of their own sovereignty to get there. And as the realisation of the enormity of this dawns on the current citizens of the EU, there will be a lot of dissent, especially where the free movement of workers is concerned. Many people will fear that current low-paid workers from the likes of Ukraine will move into the wealthier states and drive down wages. There will also be concern from the more nationally minded citizens about the massive power shift that will have to be undertaken to get there. Then there's the cost of rebuilding Ukraine. But you can see the prize. Although it would become the largest EU member state, Ukraine covers only 0.4% of the Earth's surface, but it contains 5% of the globe's mineral resources like titanium, lithium, graphite and magnesium, and a lot of arable land. But what will Russia make of this? How can Ukraine join the EU if its borders are under dispute with Russia? Especially when the FT is saying that there are already fractious disagreements among EU member states about a funding package that includes money for Ukraine to help it defend itself. The Commission wants €86 billion in additional funding to bolster the EU budget as well as lock in support for Ukraine over the next 4 years. Oh, and to give the Eurocrats a well-deserved inflation-matching pay rise, of course. And it's not going smoothly, because member states are already feeling the cost of living crisis pinch and are balking at this idea. Now, the member states are saying that the funding for Ukraine is reasonable, but the rest is not. With, according to the FT, one unnamed senior EU diplomat saying the timing is not appropriate, and adding that governments are having to make difficult decisions themselves, and now Brussels asks them to contribute more. But I would wonder if that additional funding is also designed to allow this newly announced enlargement process. After all, I doubt Charles Michel is operating in a silo here. Then there's NATO to consider. Would Putin agree to new internationally agreed borders with what remained of Ukraine? Something that could allow Ukraine to join NATO, and that would put paid to any plans for Putin to regain the old USSR territory or even have a buffer country between the Russian Federation and NATO. Or would he prefer to keep the borders disputed to make it as hard as possible for Ukraine to join the EU and NATO, or to be properly defended? After all, how can a country with a fluid border join the EU or NATO? In fact, as I understand it, a border dispute is an absolute stopper for NATO membership under its treaty. Otherwise, NATO risks being dragged instantly into a war. And remember, Russian troops have been camped well inside the Ukrainian borders since 2014. And I doubt the EU would want to risk that either. That's why I call this a power grab. Brussels wants to soak up what extra territory it can while it can. But much more importantly, the Eurocrats are seizing the chance to grasp more power for themselves. And they'll get that power before any new countries are accepted as full members. So it matters not if Ukraine is still occupied by Russia. The main goal of working towards a country called the European Union is advanced. Because at some stage, Brussels will have power over its domain equal to that of any independent country around the world. The ECB would be a true central bank, and the Commission would have control over a true treasury system. The armed forces would be controlled by the Commission. The EU Council would become a virtually powerless talking shop. The Commission would be the EU government. The elected EU Parliament would rubber stamp everything from the Commission, and member states would otherwise be toothless to protest. At that point, the EU is a country, a centrally controlled country. But next year's EU Parliament elections could throw a king-size centre-right nationalist spanner into the works. It all depends on their electorate. No wonder there are the beginnings of talk about banning one right-of-centre party, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party. I wonder if that'll spread. 'Twill be interesting to behold.